The idea of empire is actually a pretty simple one. It's based on the idea that there are nation states, and empire is the idea that one nation state, usually a pretty big one, usually a pretty rich one, wants the resources of some other nation state. And instead of wanting to buy them or trade for them, they want to simply take them. So in the old days, an empire meant you sent lots of soldiers and you sent troops to conquer another country, and you would usually kill all the soldiers you could from the local country. You would rape the women, enslave the children, and then you would declare yourself the empire that was in control of this other country. And what you would get would be a bunch of slaves, women, children, maybe some men that would be forced into your army, and you would get whatever their resources were. If it was oil, or if it was grain that they were growing, or land, might be settler colonialism. The idea of empire was tied up with colonies, that you're going to control these other countries and make them colonies of your big, powerful country. So that's really all that it means to talk about an empire. It can have all kinds of complicated results, but at the end of the day, an empire is really just one big country trying to steal the resources and maybe the land of another country pretty far away. Well, the definitions of empire have changed in terms of what the big, powerful country wants. So these days, it's not so much about wanting slaves. It's not so much about wanting more people. Usually, in fact, it's trying to keep people out of the big, powerful countries like we see in the US and Europe and other places. But it's about things like having a place where you can have military bases. So the United States, for many, is seen as being an empire of military bases. The US has almost 1,000 military bases around the world. That's not counting the ones in the United States. These are in 160 different countries. Some of them are just little tiny offices, maybe, or a small military base somewhere. Some of them, like in Germany or Japan or Korea, you have tens of thousands of US troops that are permanently stationed there. And you have lots and lots of military bases, some of which are huge air bases. You have that in the Middle East, where there are hundreds of military bases that are used to wage war. The so-called global war on terror relies on the US empire of bases to attack Afghanistan, to attack Iraq, to attack Yemen, to attack Syria. All of that is based on US control, with or without the consent of the government, of territory and bases in all these other countries.
From the White House in the office of the President of the United States, we present an address by Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
The U.S. has been in a permanent state of war for more than 100 years. We like to think that after World War II, there were no more wars until Korea. And then after Korea, there were no more wars till Vietnam. And then there was nothing until something else. The reality is the U.S. has been at war somewhere. Often what we in the United States, consider small wars. But they're not so small for the people where they're fought. The U.S. wants to be the most powerful country in the world. And that means having access to using military force wherever it suddenly feels the need to. It may not use the military force, but having, for example, a giant air base in Qatar in the Middle East, having a giant naval base in Bahrain, having a giant air base in Saudi Arabia, that gives U.S. military planners access to really easy targeting from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, or Europe, all from these bases that are not on our territory at all. They're on the territory of some other country. The issue of the financial cost of military bases and the military budget overall is huge. 64 cents out of every federal discretionary dollar, which means out of every dollar that the U.S. government can decide how to spend from U.S. tax money, 64 cents goes to the military and to police and security agencies. 54 cents goes directly to the military, directly to the Pentagon. If you add in the nuclear arsenal, the cost of taking care of veterans from earlier wars, and of course the cost of war itself, it goes up to 64 cents, 2/3 out of every dollar. So the cost is huge, and a big part of that cost is the bases, the network of bases around the world. But the cost is way more than that money. The money is an enormous cost because it's the reason that we don't have enough money all the time for things like jobs and healthcare and education, all the things that people need. The U.S. is the wealthiest country in the world, and the notion that we don't have enough money for most of our people to have healthcare is a travesty. It's an outrage. And the reason for it is that so much money goes to the military. But there's also other costs. There's social costs in the countries where we have our military bases. You have issues of the abuse of women, soldiers on a military base who get a weekend off and they go looking for sex workers, and issues of rape, issues of attacks on local people, on local women in particular. And most of the time, those soldiers are not ever held accountable for those kinds of crimes. You also have the cost to the environment. These military bases are incredibly destructive to the local environment where the bases are located. So in all of these ways, we're paying an enormous price. And if you look at what do we get back, what we get back is that people around the world hate the United States. They don't hate the United States because of, quote, our freedom. They hate the United States because we deny them their freedom. And that network of military bases is a big part of how we do it. It is the cost of being a superpower if you define superpower as being the strongest, biggest military power in the world in history, not just the world today, but the strongest military in ever, then yeah, that's the cost of doing business. But the point comes back to who benefits from that. The people of the United States don't benefit. The people in the countries where our military bases are stealing land and raping women and destroying the environment, they're not benefiting. So who benefits? It's not making us safer. It makes us less safe. Those who benefit are those who manufacture the bombs and the planes and the warships and the computer stuff that makes dumb bombs into smart bombs. Those corporations are the ones that are making a killing off of the price of being a global superpower, a military superpower. But it's not the people of the United States, it's the CEOs and shareholders of these giant military companies that are the only ones that are benefiting from this militarization. The US is absolutely subsidizing the biggest, most powerful military corporations in the world. It's almost like a welfare system for corporations. The US says we're going to spend all this money on the military to keep us safe. The vast majority of the military money goes right into the budgets of these giant corporations that produce the stuff that you use for war. And as long as we're at war, we're going to keep needing more guns, more bullets, more bombs, more white phosphorus, more illegal weapons, more legal weapons, all kinds of things. And the people who will make the profit from that is not the people of the United States, but that very small group of people who are the CEOs and the major shareholders of those giant corporations. They're the ones who benefit. The reason that the global war on terror has failed and is continuing to fail is that you can't end terrorism with war. You can't bomb terrorism out of existence. Terrorism isn't a thing. You can't bomb terrorism. You can bomb cities, you can bomb people. Sometimes you might even get lucky and bomb a terrorist. You might kill a terrorist. You might kill a bunch of terrorists. That doesn't end terrorism. Terrorism is a response, an outraged response from people who don't have a B-52 to send to bomb somewhere. They send a young man instead. That's the bomber instead of a B-52 bomber. You have a human bomber. That's what terrorism is. The US has been at war with terrorism for 15 years, and terrorism is doing just fine. Terrorism is thriving under the global war on terror because every time the US bombs somewhere and says, oh, we got a terrorist, they may be lying. They may have killed children. They may have killed civilians. They may be telling the truth, and they got someone who was actually on the US list who says, this guy's a terrorist. This guy is a bad guy. But you can be sure that in that bad guy's home, his family didn't think he was a terrorist. His community didn't think he was a terrorist. His city, his country, his religious group, his church, his synagogue, his mosque, they don't think he's a terrorist. And they're angry. They're very, very angry that this other government from across the world came and bombed their city, killed more people, saying that it's because some guy is a terrorist. It doesn't work that way. Imagine, for those of us in the United States, there have been Cuban terrorists hiding out in the United States with the agreement of the US government since the Cuban Revolution, right? And those terrorists, on occasion, have carried out horrific acts of violence, including the shooting down of a civilian Cuban airliner that killed 73 people over Barbados. It included the entire Cuban fencing team, a bunch of young kids who were learning how to fence. They were all killed. That terrorist was being protected by the United States. Imagine if the Cuban government had said, you know what? You're harboring a terrorist. We're going to come and bomb Miami. Maybe we'll get that terrorist, but if not, we'll make it so rough for the lives of people around him that they'll be punished, collective punishment for that act of terrorism. Imagine what the US would then do. It would have bombed and invaded Cuba in a minute. Luckily, the Cubans are a lot smarter than the US. So the Cubans never thought to challenge the US militarily in that way. They never thought it was legitimate for them to go and assassinate some Cuban terrorist who the US was supporting. The US believes, since 9/11 of 2001, that the US somehow, because we were once the victim of an enormous terrorist attack, a huge crime against humanity, no doubt, that somehow gives us the right to carry out this war against any country anywhere in the world, identifying anyone we say is a terrorist, assassinating them, bombing their village, kidnapping their families. There are no limits to this war. And as long as we keep waging it, more and more people, not fewer, are going to be angry. And some of those angry people are going to turn to terrorism themselves. So the war on terrorism gives rise to terrorism. It doesn't give rise to peace. The business of the war on terror is great business. Businessmen are making a killing on everything from assassination gear, the black ninja suits, to the B-52 bombs that they want to bomb. France has played a role within this global war on terror from the beginning. France refused to participate, along with Germany and many other countries, refused to participate in the Iraq war early on. But from the beginning, France was part of the coalition in Afghanistan and later became part of the coalition in Libya. There are French troops elsewhere in the region now. So France is a great partner of the US global war on terror, and France is paying a price. It's paying the price economically, just like Americans are, that there's not enough money for healthcare, there's not enough money for education, there's not enough money for jobs. And French citizens are paying that price, just like American citizens are paying the price. But the ultimate price is not being paid by the French or by the Americans. The ultimate price is being paid by the Afghans and the Iraqis, the Libyans and the Yemenis. Those are the people who are paying the ultimate price for this folly of what's known as the global war on terror. Every time a nation sends troops abroad to go to war, every time a nation announces that we collectively are somehow at war, it means that it has to prepare young soldiers and the people at home to believe that it's somehow okay to be slaughtering people across the world. In this case, whether it's the United States or France, the governments have to convince ordinary young Americans, ordinary young French women and French men who are in the military that it's somehow okay to kill people because they happen to have had the bad luck to be born in Afghanistan, or in Yemen, or in Libya, or wherever. So that means there has to be some kind of demonization that says, it's okay to kill these people because they're not like us. They're not fully human. It's okay to kill them. That means that other people who look like those people, who might be Iraqi or Yemeni, or might look like someone who's Iraqi or Yemeni, who might be the same religion as someone who's Iraqi or Yemeni or Afghan. It might be a woman who wears a hijab just like women in Iraq or Yemen. That those people are also not like us. Those people are also not worthy of equality, of equal rights. So it's okay to make fun of them. It's okay to pass laws saying that a woman who believes that her religion requires her to dress modestly on the beach, to say that's not acceptable, and to demand that she take off her shirt on the beach, because to be French means to wear a bikini, not a burkini. This is designed to support wars. These things don't just happen on their own. They're designed to support wars. When Donald Trump encourages mobs of people saying that he will pay for their lawyers if they beat up protesters in his campaign rallies, he's not just doing that arbitrarily. He's doing that in a way that encourages the demonization of certain people, whether it's journalists, in that case, whether it's Muslims, like the Muslim ban in the United States. This is all about building support for war. It has a reason. It doesn't just happen. So racism feeds the wars, and the wars, in return, feed racism at home. Every country that is at war, especially when it's an unpopular war, or a war that most people don't really understand why we're fighting it. What are we fighting for in Libya? What are we fighting for in Afghanistan? How is that making us safer? How is that making the world freer? These are the questions that ordinary French people, ordinary Americans ask. So anytime a government is trying to support a war like that, it means they have to demonize people who are like the victims of that war. It means that they have to make it criminal in some cases to provide support to the victims of that war. So you have in the United States something that's known as the prohibition on providing material support for terrorism. So what does that mean? The Supreme Court had a ruling, and they said that means it's illegal. If I happen to meet somebody from ISIS, I don't know where I ever would, but if I met someone from ISIS and I said to that person, you could use nonviolence to fight for what you want rather than using such terrible violence. And here's how you do it. This is what nonviolent training looks like. I would be subject to 20 years in a federal prison France has very similar laws saying that it's illegal to provide material support, and who knows what they define as material support, for anyone that we say is a potential terrorist. Then you have the criminalization of other things. So on the question of Palestine, where there is such a massive shift underway in the discourse, how we talk about Israel, how we talk about Palestinian rights, how we talk about the nonviolent boycott movement known as BDS, a movement that has had enormous impact on changing how people around the world believe they now can have a way of bringing nonviolent pressure to bear on Israel to stop its violations of international law. In France, direct support of BDS under some circumstances might even be illegal. So we have these domestic laws that are designed to support US wars, French wars, and foreign policy goals that have nothing to do with peace and democracy, and everything to do with making money for corporations, creating wars that last a generation or more, and maintaining wars against the so-called other all around the world. I don't think governments want to hear it. I think activists and people and civil society and citizens need to hear it because we're the ones that have to hold our governments accountable. That's our job.